on this Reformation Sunday. It's a lot of things today. It's Celebration Sunday. It's also Reformation Sunday. And so the lection out of the New Testament, one of the lections comes out of Hebrews. It's a passage that we often don't understand because it talks about priests. And in the Presbyterian tradition, we don't know much about priests, and we certainly don't know about high priests. But the new church needs to understand something, because the Jews of the first century knew all about priests. They knew all about high priests. So the writer is trying to suggest something for them, and maybe it's something for us today too. I'm going to begin today reading out of Hebrews. It's chapter 7, verses 23 through 28. Listen for this word. What is being said here about who the real priest is? Furthermore, the former priests were many in number, referencing priests going back into the biblical history, many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. In other words, the human priests would die off. They'd have to raise up new priests, so it was a continual process. But he, the writer says, holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Consequently, he is able for all time to save those who approach God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. Verse 26 says, "For it was fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, blameless, undefiled, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priest, he has no need to offer sacrifices day after day." In other words, the high priest had to always atone for sins. But this high priest doesn't have to offer sacrifices day after day for his own sins and then for those of the people. This he did once and for all. Once and for all. When he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests those who are subject to weakness, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. May God bless the reading and the hearing of God's holy word. Who is the priest that's being spoken about? Jesus, right. So we're in the final of our series that's been going on. This will be week 5 in our series called The Jesus Connection. And we've been working through this subject and looking at scriptures and trying to understand this idea of the Jesus Connection. And if you remember way back, week 1, we talked about being who we are, who we're created to be. Week 2, we talked about connecting to the world. Part 3, Jody talked about, while we were in Israel, Jody talked about connecting to the kingdom of God. Last week, I talked about connecting your power. Remember the story about Goliath? We talked about connecting your power. And then some might be saying, okay, you've covered a lot of topics. Are you not missing one really important topic? What would that be? It would be Jesus, right? The title is called The Jesus Connection, after all. So today, we're going to talk about the greatest connection of all. It's Celebration Sunday. I thought, what a better time to talk about the most incredible connection ever been made. And that is the cross of Jesus Christ. So let's begin. In the cross, we've heard this story so many times, but I think we have to go back to basics. You know, the Baptists have it all over us. They talk about the gospel story all the time. You know, Presbyterians, we like to dig into the Greek. We like to dig into the Hebrew. We want to understand every little bit. So today we're going to back up a little bit and talk about the cross. It's that connection, really. If we talk about who we are and who God is, I gave you the little example with the children today. The gulf between humankind and the Creator God. Humankind being those that, you know, like they talked about the priest, we kind of have to offer some kind of atonement. We're not able to do it. We die off. But then on the other side, there's God. And there's this chasm. So the gospel story, in one sentence, is this healing of a vast chasm between God and ourselves. And what happens there, and you know, most of you have been to church a lot, you know the story, but it is important to say it. It's bridging that most important relationship in the world. We all have relationships. Sometimes they get broken. Sometimes they get repaired. There's one that's essential. There's one that's more important than all the rest. And that's for folks of faith, is to say the relationship between the one who made us and who we are. And how does that work for us? Martin Luther, it is Reformation Sunday, so I threw this little Martin Luther quote in here. He's lecturing on the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, and he describes the position. He didn't use barnyard animals and stools, but he's talking about this that I tried to demonstrate in a very simple way for the children. He describes the position of who we are and the remedy. He said, one has sinned, another has made satisfaction. The sinner doesn't make the satisfaction, and the satisfier does not sin. And the famous words are salvation by grace through faith, right? In Jesus Christ. That was Luther's whole deal. He was like, we can't make our own bridge. We need help. We need help with that. When I grew up, I grew up on a little creek. It was called Christopher Creek in Lakewood in Jacksonville. And that creek was about maybe as wide as, it's maybe from here to the arch over there. And we had friends on both sides of the creek. My side of the creek, I had lots of friends I went to school with. But on the other side, there were also friends. But you couldn't get over there. There was no way to get across. And so we mostly hung out with the folks on our side of the creek because it was just natural. It was too hard. You would have to drive 3 miles to go all the way around to get to their side of the creek. However, where there's a will, there's a way, right? And at one point in the creek was this water pipe, a water main, because they had to get water to that neighborhood. So they had like this concrete little outcropping that held the pipe, and then it was suspended all the way across to the other side. So some of us got the smart idea, right? We called it walking the pipe. And we did it all the time. Some people couldn't quite balance well, and they would scooch you, they'd scooch you across. But we would walk the pipe. And maybe that's why I got such good balance for surfing, because all those years of walking the pipe. However, if you weren't careful, what would happen? The consequences were pretty severe. You fall in the creek, it's muddy, dirty. There were snakes and all that kind of thing. Jesus dealt with a much larger problem than just, friends on one side with a gap in the middle and friends on the other. He's talking about all of creation, all of humankind, all of his love wanting to be poured on all of us. That's a huge dilemma when there seemed to be this chasm between us. We call it, we don't use the word much anymore because people don't like the word, but it's sin, it's brokenness. It's the brokenness in the world. You see that so clearly in the news of just a couple of things that have happened recently. The brokenness in humanity in the world, so that brokenness is still there. But the word is, and the gospel lesson is, and if you want to break it down to the most simplistic way of talking about it, it's healing the chasm, right? It's bridging the gap between God and ourselves. Now, in the 70s, when we were really, the Jesus movement was on really strong, and we were out, thinking we were grand little evangelists at 17 and 18 years old, they would give us these little tracts, right? You ever had the guy on the street corner give you the tract? Ours were pretty nice. They weren't the kind that said, you better believe or you're going, where. But it had a description very similar to what I did with the children here. And it describes this bridging of the bridging of the gap. So I have a picture here that shows it. It'll pop up as if by magic any moment. Not that one. It'll be bridging the gap. It won't be that one either. It'll be bridging the gap. You'll know it has a big cross on it. So, Who has seen this thing? I mean, it's been around forever, right? Forever. And it's a very simplistic kind of thing. But this is the way people in the 70s were describing this broken relationship, and how they would describe it, just as I did with the barnyard animals. People on one side, God on the other. A little bit simplistic, but yet it gets the picture that there's something wrong. There's something disconnected in who we are. And you see that in the brokenness of the world. And God says that's unacceptable. So what does God do? God remedies, God connects, God bridges the gap. So the cartoon kind of demonstration here is the cross. So they would lay the cross between the 2 points, right? Representing bridging the gap, kind of like my very sophisticated piece of wood here with barnyard animals on it, to show how to get from one side to the other. Healing the chasm, healing the isolation, creating some kind of way for us to be connected in relationship with a God who loves us, cares for us, longs for us, right? So spanning the chasm is the Jesus connection, right? Rebuilding, bridging, connecting, closing the gap, any of the terms you want. Now, for many years, people have used that simple diagram. And if you go home and Google it today, if you put Jesus bridges the gap, you'll get about 30 of those pictures, because people use them all the time. There's videos, there's all kinds of things on it. But I try to think, okay, that's a little bit, maybe that loses us. Maybe it's too simplistic. Maybe as Presbyterians, we're the deep thinkers, look into Scripture. We want to figure this. Maybe that's too cartoonish for us. It's too much of a kind of a caricature of what God does. So I tried to think, what for us today on this Celebration Sunday, where the title of the message today is Celebrating Crossings. How could we represent the greatest love ever? How does that work for us? What image could I get? I thought, oh God, I talked to Jody about building. I actually wanted to build a giant bridge up here. I was going to have these big blocks, and I looked into buying big styrofoam blocks, and they were about $500 a piece, and I'm like, we're not building the bridge. We'll do something else. And then I came in the other day, and I was seated where you are. And I looked up in the back of the church. What do you see? You see a cross, but what else do you see? It struck me. Look at the image. You have 2 mountainsides with a gap between them, and what's connecting them? The cross, right? The cross. I thought, for 30 years, that image has been up there, and I don't know if anybody ever got it. They didn't design it that way. I think that's serendipitous, right? That it happens to have 2 elements, right and left, separated, and the bridging element is the cross that's seated between them. They probably thought the cross looks really good in the middle, and for symmetry, we'll put the pipes. I thought, there's a way to think about this, bridging the gap. It's not a water pipe, this time. It's organ pipes. I thought, okay, maybe God's trying to tell us something. The other thing I think God's trying to tell us is not just them. So often we look at these stories, and we look at the gospel story, and at Easter we talk about, and Lent we talk about the passion of Christ and death on the cross and then resurrection. And everything's focused backward, right? It's all focused to what Jesus did. But it's not just then. It's actually now. This time it's not as the Rolling Stones tried to suggest in their song, time is on our side. Time isn't on our side. We all know that. Every day our time slips away. Our bridges wear out. Our bridges break down because they're time sensitive, right? Anything we make with human hands, time sensitive. That's what Hebrews was trying to allude to. Folks, we get older. We have to keep replenishing. Humanity has to keep being replenished. Things made by human designs, human materials, they seem worthy for the moment, but they always seem to degrade. Now, when I was little, back in Jacksonville, my dad would take us on these country drives. And one of the scariest drives we would ever take is from Jacksonville to Green Cove Springs. There was an old wooden bridge, and this thing was like almost 2 miles long. There it is, the old Shands Bridge. Anybody ever drive over the old, thank goodness. Okay, a few of you have. That thing, man, it's wood. Look at it. And there were cars. That's not one way. That's a two-way bridge. And I remember being terrified at that thing. It was almost like I could feel it moving, and it was so rickety and I'm like, oh my gosh. And what happens over time? Here's what happens over time. Here's the Shands Bridge now. It's gone. It's deteriorated. They left part of it as a fishing bridge, and even that's gone now. We need a bridge that lasts forever. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying, an eternal bridge. And the bridge has a name. The writer's comparing Jesus with that Levitical priesthood, right? That it's like the bridge, it deteriorates, it goes away. And basically the writer is saying the cross of Jesus is the permanent connection to this life. It's a permanent connection to life, not 2,000 years ago, today. Because that bridging moment is continuing. That's what the writer's saying. It continues on and on, the bridging moment, because of the cross. Verse 25, Jesus is able for all time to save those, that means you and I, everyone who approaches through him, since he alone lives. Listen to this. Jesus lives to make intercession for us. Not lived, lives to make intercession for us. Not just in the past, today. Why is that so? Because Jesus is immortal. I love what one writer says. Jesus is immortal. He holds his priesthood permanently, so there's no chance he's going to die on you again, right? He did that already. He died once. And that's what priests do, though. They make intercession, right? They make intercession for us. But our priest is not time limited. Our high priest, the point in this Hebrews passage, is a personal priest that steps into the gap for us. The writer says, has our backs. I like that, has our backs. This is what a priest does when we're in trouble. Our personal high priest says, hey, don't worry. It's on me. I got this. One of the modern writers, N.T. Wright, says, Jesus is the place of atonement, fancy word, the place where heaven and earth meet. I get that better. That's why straight after his great prayer, he goes out to face the consequences of bringing together utter holiness on one side, the utter holiness of heaven, and the utter brokenness of earth. The utter joy of heaven and the utter misery of earth. He brings it together. And that's what his priesthood is all about. Standing at the painful, holy place where the great fracture in creation is healed. The great gulf bridged, where the Word has become flesh, pitched his tent among us, in our midst, revealing God's glory as the Father's only Son, whose very nature is love. N.T. Wright closes with this, the glory and the prayer. Oh, that was the name of the passage, the piece he wrote. So what do we do if it's true? If it's true that we have a permanent connection, a connection that never fails, it's not time limited, it's a matter of bringing us into relationship, not only with one another, but also with the God that created us. And this all has happened and is happening, and it's current, and it's available. What do? What's the natural response? I was in Israel, but I know while I was in Israel that the lottery got way up. Didn't it get up to like $1 billion? Think of that, $1 billion. Many of you have promised me if you win that lottery, you'll pay off the mortgage. So I'm still waiting for that. But $1 billion, can you imagine? How many people, don't raise your hand. Just say it in your mind. How many people played the lottery for that? How many people, roll the dice? Could I win $1 billion? What would you do if you won the lottery? $1 billion. You would probably, okay, right? Is that what you'd do? Would you freak out? I would freak out. And I don't freak out, so that's a big thing, right? I would freak out. Celebrating the crossings, celebrating this gap being closed is for each of us when we claim faith in Jesus Christ. It's an incredible love that's laid down for us. I love that literal thought of laying down. What did Jesus have to do to go on the cross? They laid him down. It says in John 15:3, there's no greater love than this, that a person should lay down his life for his friends. Jesus goes on to say, I call you friends. I call you friends. He literally lays down the connection on the cross. It's the lottery. It's more than ability. There is no value to be placed. It's so beyond our conception. So how do we celebrate? Well, we're Presbyterians, aren't we? Some of us. Anyway, we're Presbyterians. So how do Presbyterians celebrate? Well, first we form a committee. We have to study the reasons and the purpose for the celebration, right? And then we decide who to invite, because that's important. You have to have invitations, and how many do you need? And then we have to decide when it's going to occur. Then the extent of the celebration. What kind of punch do we need to have? And what color should the table decorate? Am I kidding? What kind of table decorations? And what committee's going to pay for it? Right? That's how we do it. And by no means should there be dancing and hoopla and celebration, right? No raucous dancing music. Is this really Reformed? It's Reformation Sunday. It's also Celebration Sunday. Is this really Reformed? You know, the Reformers, we learned on our cruise to the UK, we did our Reformation cruise. We learned that the Reformers were in a season where people were beginning to say, I'm not just trusting what you're telling me. I want to read it for myself. And because the Bible was not widely read, as a matter of fact, it was outlawed for typical people like you and I to read a Bible. You could be put to death for it. True story. True story? True story. Put to death for reading the Bible. So the Reformers were saying, back to the sources. We want to read this stuff for ourselves. Don't just tell us things. We want to see it in the Scripture. So I want to go back to the sources. How should Presbyterians, we are the Reformation. That's where we came from, right? We are the ones, our history, we are the ones that said back to the sources. I want to offer you, as I close today, a little source here. This comes out of 2 Samuel 6, chapter 6, verses 1 through 19. I'm not going to read it. I'm going to paraphrase it because you know the story. David has finally conquered. He has united all the tribes. He is moving. The ark has been in a tent in the wilderness, and he says that is no good for God's presence to live in a tent. We're going to bring that ark into Jerusalem, and this is the old Jerusalem. This is not the temple as we know it today. So he brings the ark in, and you know the story. He is so elated that the presence of God is actually going to be among the people. It's going to be near him. The presence of God, not way out, it's close in. He freaks out. It's a biblical term. You can look it up later. He does, and he starts dancing. Dancing. Becky, he's dancing. This is bizarre because not only is David a king, he's the high priest. He wore both of those crowns. The priests were proper. They did not dance. They did not twirl. They did not do any of those things. Listen to verse 5. David and all the house of Israel were making merry. They're making merry before the Lord with all their might. That's mayod. It means with all their muchness, everything they've got, right? With songs, lyres, harps. Terry, you left out the lyres, the harps. Okay. Castanets, I didn't say. Cymbals I heard. They left out the castanets, cymbals, and David danced before the Lord, leaping and dancing. Last week I gave you the story about David and Goliath, right? David, the little guy, 4'8", defeats the 7 to 8 to 9 foot Goliath. He does it with one shot, one small smooth stone. In the story, does David leap and dance? He just defeated a mighty army. And he doesn't dance. But he dances here. He dances because God's presence has come close. The word here is, in Hebrew, it's meholah. It means twisting, skipping, leaping with joy in response. It's an expression of thanksgiving to God. That's the word used. That's what David is doing. So like the lottery winner, wouldn't you just go nuts? Or would you do the golf clap? Very good, very good. You won the lottery, very good. $1 billion. Brian, $1 billion, very good. Right. No. David's not so prolific response. He is enthusiastic, to say the least. I love this, enthusiastic. You know where the word comes from? Entheos. Entheos, in God, enthusiastic. Did you know enthusiastic meant in God? He's in God, he's enthusiastic. And he's rolling and shaking and he's strutting his kingly stuff. He's just doing it. He makes some people mad because he's acting a little bit undignified. There's actually a song called Undignified. I was going to ask you guys to do it, but I gave you a break. Undignified. Because he exposes himself. And there's a lot of controversy about what that means. Was he dancing naked? The research I said says no. To expose, once again, the Hebrew word means to cause to be visible, open to public view. David is in public view celebrating God's presence. That's the kind of thing I want us to do in just a moment. I want us to expose ourselves in celebration of what God, within limits, by the way. Limits, Becky, within limits. Okay, within limits, I want us to celebrate the year of ministry that we have just experienced, and it's been a tremendous year of ministry, but also celebrate the activity that God is doing right now in your hearts and what God's going to do in the next 12 months. We've done some incredible things. There is more to come. We need to continue sharing God's love, and I want us to celebrate this. And so I'm going to close with this story. Then Terry's going to play a song, and we're going to encourage you, if you've brought your celebratory responses, to bring your time and talents and your intention of giving. If you have that envelope, we're going to come forward as they sing, place them. That's our celebration. And if you want to skip a little bit up the aisle, I don't care. Place it on the communion table. But I want to close with this. There's a Hasidic tale about a famous rabbi. You know, rabbis are quite proper, prim, and he's gotten an invitation to come to a small village and visit because they have lots of questions, and the rabbi's going to answer the questions. So the long-awaited day comes. He gets to the village. The excited villagers rush in, and they bring him into a large room where they've all gathered. The rabbi, rather than inviting them to start asking questions, the rabbi walked around slowly and deliberately, silently looking at each villager in the eye as he softly starts to hum. He's humming a religious tune that was somewhat familiar to them. So engaging was this rabbi's gentle manner that before they knew it, others started humming along. Slowly, a little more, a little more. The rabbi started to dance. Soon people found themselves dancing with the rabbi. And the movements grew wilder and more frenzied, and the people of the village soon lost themselves in the dance. When the dancing finally ended, the rabbi took one more walk around the room, looking deeply into the eyes of each person in turn. And he says this, "I trust I have answered all your questions," he said. His point had been made. When God is in the house, it calls for celebration. Worship can dismiss that celebration. But the nature of God's people gathered in the presence of God calls this out of us. So let's take this moment now. Celebrate God's reforming power. We do that through the Reformation, but in the church, but also more importantly, celebrate God's resurrection power, connecting power in our lives. So I'm just going to ask Terry to reprise a little song. You can come forward and place your time and talents, your strengths that we talked about last week, your one smooth stone, place it here on the table. Come.